Welcome back, Sebastian here, and time for my power rankings for the 2024 Formula 1 Dutch Grand Prix. Not the most exciting of Grand Prix, but I think it was definitely one where there was definitely some clear gaps, I think, in terms of performance throughout the field. So I felt that actually this power ranking was not quite as difficult as it was as some of the previous races have been. So starting right away with number 20, I think a driver that's pretty easy to judge, and that is Logan Sargent. Now for Sargent, he did not qualify. He crashed quite heavily in free practice 3. Damage was so severe to the car that they were unable to repair it for qualifying. So that's definitely a big mark against him this weekend. In the race, it actually wasn't too bad. Finished 16th, a couple positions behind his teammate. But I think in terms of actual time loss, it was closer to 30 seconds. So again, race pace not exactly fantastic there. Number 19. We're going to go with Zhou Guanyu. For Zhou, qualified 18th, out-qualified by his teammate Valtteri Bottas by 1.093 seconds. And that's simply a qualifying margin that's too big in Formula 1. On top of the really poor qualifying for Zhou, he also finished dead last, 20th in the race, about 30 seconds behind his teammate Bottas. So a pretty poor weekend from Zhou and Sargent, two drivers who, for the most part, have found themselves glued to the bottom two positions in my power rankings throughout the season. Number 18, I decided to go with Esteban Ocon. Now, I don't think Esteban Ocon had an especially poor weekend, but I think it's simply contrasted by the fact that his teammate had a very good weekend, and it definitely showed that the car was much better, was capable of much more than what Ocon showed this weekend. For Ocon, he qualified 16th, out-qualified by 0.277 seconds, so just almost 0.3 of a second there. So again, qualifying margin a little bit too big for Ocon's liking. And in the race, finished in 15th, but was overtaken by drivers who did start quite far behind him. So again, not a great weekend, I felt, for Ocon. Number 17. Decided to go with Lance Stroll. For Stroll, could justify putting him a couple positions higher. Qualified P8, of course, that was P9 before Albon's disqualification. Out-qualified by Alonso by 0.224 seconds. Through qualifying, did look very, very quick at certain points. Looked like he could challenge qualifying inside the top 6, but on those final runs in Q3, just not able to put the lap in. In the race itself, I don't think he was terrible, but he did pick up that 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, a very, very simple thing to do. Also a very avoidable mistake. So something that, without that penalty, I probably would have put Stroll a little bit higher. But for today, I've decided to put him in 17th. 16th, I've gone with Kevin Magnussen. For Magnussen, not a terrible weekend. Qualifying was actually pretty close in terms of the gap between himself and his teammate Nico Hülkenberg. Only qualified by 8/100ths of a second. And in the Grand Prix itself, went on a very ambitious one-stop strategy, hoping for that safety car. Safety car never came, so that final race placement looks a lot worse than I think it really should have been. But of course, with the safety car, I don't know if they would have been able to get points, but I think they definitely could have been. Magnussen could have definitely been 11th or 12th place. So yeah, Magnussen ends up in 18th, but again, that result's really heavily affected by the strategy that they decided to use for him. Number 15, I decided to go with Valtteri Bottas. Your car, when you're out qualifying your teammate by a second, and you still qualify only one position above your teammate, your car is pretty terrible. And that's the situation that Valtteri Bottas finds himself in right now. He qualified 17th, again out-qualified Zhou by about a second. That's doing exactly what he needs to be doing. And then in the race, finished 19th, again only one position ahead of his teammate Zhou. So for Bottas, it's actually quite hard to rank him right now because given the gaps that he's pulling on his teammate, you would expect that he would also be able to be ahead of a couple other drivers as well. But because the fact that his results on paper are still so poor, really suggests the Sauber's a very, very poor car, worst on the grid, but I think a decent margin at this point. And it's starting to be a similar situation to Russell in 2019, where he was consistently out-qualifying, beating Robert Kubica week in, week out, but the performance on track just didn't really show it just because the Williams car was so bad. And that's kind of the similar situation that Bottas finds himself in. Number 14, Daniel Ricciardo. So for Ricciardo, qualified 15th, out-qualified by 0.34 seconds, so a bit over 0.3 of a second. The gap in qualifying definitely a little bit bigger than he would have liked. But the race, I think, actually went pretty well. He finished 13th on track, but was promoted to 12th place with that penalty for Lance Stroll. And again, did finish ahead of his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, who of course has not shown up on the board yet. But I just felt that Tsunoda's weekend was really hampered by the strategy that the team decided to put him on. And I think with the qualifying, I decided, all things considered, I decided to put Ricciardo slightly behind his Japanese teammate. Speaking of Japanese teammate, I've decided to put Tsunoda 13th right in front of Ricciardo. I felt they were pretty close, relatively speaking. Of course, big gap in qualifying, and then in the race, with the two-stop strategy for Tsunoda, I made any real comparison between the two very, very difficult. But I've decided just to put Tsunoda ahead of Ricciardo. Tsunoda qualified P12, again with that 3.4 tenths gap, and then ended up 17th in the race. Decided to go on a two-stop strategy, didn't really work. Was unable to really overtake any of the cars after his second stop. So he basically lost a lot of track position and then just couldn't make the time up. Similar situation to a certain Mercedes driver that we will talk about a bit later. So that takes us to 13th. And I really felt like there was a pretty big gap between the drivers 13th and down and the drivers 12th and up. And the first of those drivers in the top 12 is actually going to be Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, you might be surprised, why would I put him in 12th? He finished 4th on the road, not a terrible Grand Prix. But the reality is, when you look at, for example, gaps to his teammate, it was a pretty poor weekend, all things considering, for Oscar Piastri. Arguably one of his worst weekends in F1, just in terms of gaps to his teammate Lando Norris. So he qualified 3rd, so again, pretty good result on paper, but he was out-qualified by 0.499 seconds. So basically half a second he was out-qualified by, which again is a margin that's just too big in F1. In the race, finished 4th, went on a bit of an aggressive strategy to try to get himself a spot on the podium and potentially beat Max Verstappen as well. That didn't really work out. He ended up finishing 4th, 27 seconds behind his teammate. So again, you can say the strategy might have hurt him a bit, but in reality he was just struggling to keep up with Charles Leclerc in the inferior Ferrari. So not a great weekend for Piastri, so I decided to put him in 12th. Another driver from that top group of cars I really felt struggled was Sergio Perez. Now for Perez, it was relatively speaking a bit of a better weekend compared to what we have seen, at some of Perez's real low points, such as Canada, for example. He qualified 6th, 0.387 seconds off of Max Verstappen. So again, that's about in the ballpark of where you would want him to be. In the race, he finished 6th, 17 seconds down on his teammate. And all in all, that's about what we've come to expect for Perez. It's still not a good performance, but it's about what the best that we've come to expect over the last year and a half or so. Number 10, I'm going with Nico Hülkenberg. For Hülkenberg, qualified 13th, out-qualified his teammate by 0.08 of a second, so qualifying very, very close between himself and Kevin Magnussen. But in the race, I thought did a really good job with the strategy, was one of the earliest pitters onto the hard tires, and came very, very close to making those hard tires last until the end. He was in a points-paying position until the final few laps, where he was overtaken by Gasly and Alonso. But all in all, I felt a really good Grand Prix for Hülkenberg, did a really good job of making use of the tires. And unlike some of the other drivers who pitted around him, they ended up having to switch to a two-stop strategy, but Hülkenberg made that one-stop strategy work. And even though it didn't end up with points at the end of the day, the fact that he was able to stay on those initial set of hard tires right to the end, while the pace wasn't great, he was still kind of thereabouts. And again, if someone had been disqualified, for example, as happened in Spa, Hülkenberg would look like a hero with getting that 1 point in P10. So into the top 9 we go, and at number 9, I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton. For Lewis Hamilton, qualified in 11th, out-qualified by George Russell by 0.396 seconds, so about 0.4 of a second. made a mistake on his final quality run in Q2, which of course contributed to him getting knocked out in qualifying. And then from there, of course, got a 3-place grid penalty for impeding Sergio Perez. Didn't feel like he could have done much more in that situation instead of just drive off track or just stop on track. So I'm not really punishing him for that penalty. I am punishing him though for the fact that his qualifying was so poor, and he made that massive mistake which led to him getting knocked out in Q2. In the Grand Prix, he did recover, had a bit of a tough race having to overtake so many cars on that 2-stop strategy, but at the end of the day, he did finish 8th and was only 5 seconds off his teammate. But again, I think that 5-second gap is more because of the wonderful strategy that Mercedes decided to put George Russell on. All right, number 8. I'm going to go with Carlos Sainz. For Sainz, qualified P10 and ended up in 5th in the race. In qualifying, the gap to his teammate Charles Leclerc was a little bit bigger than he would normally have hoped, 0.225 seconds, so just over 0.2 of a second. And then in the Grand Prix, finishing 5th, I thought did a really, really good job in the Grand Prix, really strong race pace, some really nice overtakes as well, especially the one on Pierre Gasly. In terms of finishing gap with his teammate, it was 7 seconds at the end of the Grand Prix, and given the relative how far apart they finished, they started on the grid, I think that's a pretty reasonable gap for Sainz. Number 7, I'm going to go with Fernando Alonso. For Alonso, qualified in 7th, out-qualified his teammate by 0.224 seconds, so again, qualifying did go pretty well. It did look like at points that he was going to be out-qualified by Stroll, but at the end of the day, he put the lap down and I think did a really good qualifying to qualify 7th. In the race, unfortunately, fell back a bit, finished 10th, but I think with Hamilton and Sainz coming through, I think realistically the best case he could have done was 9th. And I think Aston, pitted a little bit too late going onto the hard tires. They felt that having those extra lap on the hard tires meant that they would have the pace later in the Grand Prix, but unfortunately not to be for Alonso as he finishes in 10th. Number 6, very strange to see a driver who finished so far outside the points start be this high on my power rankings, but that's how I felt Albon did. So of course for Albon, he was disqualified for qualifying after qualifying in 8th. Of course, his floor was illegal, and this gets into a very murky question about, how much performance would that illegal floor have added. Realistically, it probably would have been very, very minimal, and it probably did not make the difference between him getting into Q3 versus not getting into Q3, for example. So for Albon, excellent qualifying session, got himself up into the top 10, really unfortunate with this disqualification. In the Grand Prix, really aggressive 2-stop strategy. He was the first driver to pit for hard tires. And unlike, for example, for Tsunoda, for example, he was actually able to make positions up after his second stop. So he ended up 14th on the road, which after starting from the pit lane in a car that's where that is about where Williams is right now, I think it's honestly a really good weekend, all things considered. The points, the results on paper wasn't great, but I think just looking at the performance, I felt Albon had a very strong weekend. Now, moving into the top 5. George Russell. Now for Russell, it was a bit of a mixed bag of a Grand Prix. Qualified 4th, but the qualifying gap to his teammate very, very strong, and I felt he really maximized the result in qualifying as he often has done this year. But the result in the Grand Prix, I think, was leaving a little bit to be desired, and whether that was an issue with Russell specifically or an issue in Mercedes is yet to really be seen. And again, Mercedes made that really I felt really poor strategic decision pitting Russell so late in the Grand Prix, and then it ended up losing him 2 places compared to where he was before he pitted. He was in 5th. They said according to their simulations, he was basically guaranteed to lose a position to Sainz, but even with that, even taking that out of consideration, he still lost a position to Perez and never regained that position. So, but yeah, all in all, I think a good Grand Prix from Russell, just really unfortunate with the result. Number 4, I'm going to go with Pierre Gasly. Qualifying 9th, out-qualified his teammate Esteban Ocon by 0.277 seconds. Really good qualifying there. After qualifying for the most part this year has definitely been in Ocon's favor. Finished 9th in the Grand Prix. Really good result though. I felt he maximized his points, his opportunities today. And yeah, just a really fantastic all-around result for Gasly in a car that we know is pretty poor, getting that best of the rest result. And that brings us into the top 3, which, if you have been counting, is also the top 3 in the result. So effectively, your podiums all in the top 3, which again is a bit of a boring result, but I felt that it was really hard to argue against any of those 3 drivers to be in the top 3. So number 3, I've gone with Charles Leclerc. So for Leclerc, he qualified 6th, out-qualified his teammate by just over 0.2 of a second. Qualifying, I think, could have been a little bit better, but it was very strange for Ferrari. The qualifying result was not as good as their race pace, and thus led to Leclerc having a pretty good result on Sunday. On Sunday, I think Leclerc did an excellent job keeping Piastri behind, and just had really, really strong pace all throughout that we know he has. He's just simply been limited by the poor race pace of the Ferraris that he's generally driven throughout his career. Number 2, I'm going to go with Max Verstappen. I think you can make a really good argument for Leclerc at 2, Verstappen at 3. I think these 2 drivers were very, very close in terms of ultimate pace, but I did decide at the end to put Verstappen in 2nd. Qualified 2nd, out-qualified his teammate by almost 0.4 of a second. Out-qualified Oscar Piastri as well in the superior McLaren, and in the race got a really good start, got into the lead of the race, and then unfortunately for him at least, and for the Dutch fans, the race pace of the Red Bull was just not there to match the McLaren. He was easily overtaken, and then from there Verstappen basically just cruised home to a pretty comfortable P2 result. I think all in all, Verstappen really did the best he could. Not really a whole lot he could have done to take the win. Seeing how our race winner Lando Norris, who of course is also our driver at number 1, had such phenomenal, such fantastic pace in the Grand Prix, one of the most dominant wins that we've seen from a driver other than Max Verstappen over the last handful of years. So very natural decision, I think, to put Norris at number 1. Of course, out-qualified his teammate Oscar Piastri by 0.5 second and qualified on pole as well. Of course, wasn't a perfect weekend from Norris. He had a bit of a poor start again, and that's something that's been a bit of a trend. And again, I think at some tracks where overtaking is possible, it's not going to be too much of an issue. But for example, if that happened at Monaco, he probably doesn't retake the lead of the race. So again, it's something that Norris is going to have to work on. But all in all, it was an absolutely fantastic weekend for the McLaren driver. So there you go. There's my power rankings for the 2024 Dutch Grand Prix. I'm sorry about this glare from this massive bar coming through my window. Usually don't take videos early in the morning, but didn't have time yesterday after the Grand Prix to finish this. So again, you get it now. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.